Can you hear me? Is it going to the mic? Oh, it is. All right, good.
Check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2. I can do that. Right there, right? Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all of you here tonight in the audience, as well as for those who are joining us via live stream. And an especially warm welcome to our speakers, Kisleya Prasad and Eric Peterson, who I'll introduce in just a moment. My name is Marina Augustidis. I'm an Associate Director with the Center for Global Business here at Maryland Smith, and I have the pleasure of introducing the event tonight, which is the first installment of the Center for Global Business Distinguished Speaker Series in International Business for the spring semester. We at the Center for Global Business like to call this DSS, so I'll refer to that as I introduce the event. This is a monthly series intended to address the latest trends in international business, and we like to bring content to our students that they would otherwise not get in the classroom, or they complement their material in the classroom. DSS is an international business is supported by the Center for International Business Education and Research, which is a Title VI grant provided by the U.S. Department of Education. The Center for Global Business is one of 15 schools across the country to have this grant, which aims to foster international understanding and promote the ability for U.S. businesses to compete globally. Our event tonight is an annual part of DSS, where we look at the current and future outlook of the global business environment with Eric Peterson of A.T. Kearney, or Kearney, as I think they're now calling it.
Correct, that's right.
Which is a global management consulting firm. Tonight, we'll look at one of A.T. Kearney's most current research reports, the Year Ahead Predictions Report of 2020. This report is available on their website for those of you who are interested in reading further about 10 significant trends in events taking shape in 2020 that companies should be preparing for. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping topics. There will be time at the end for Q&A at the end of the hour. At the time, we encourage you all to ask questions. If you would approach either microphone on either sides of the room to ask your question, we just ask that you introduce yourself and your UMD affiliation. For those of you joining us live stream, your questions can be tweeted at Smith Global Biz, or emailing Santiago Luna at sluna@rhsmith.umd.edu. I believe that information is also at the bottom of your screen. And please introduce yourself if possible as well. Now to introduce our speakers this evening, Eric Peterson is a partner and managing director at Kearney's Global Business Policy Council, a strategic advisory service designed for the world's top CEOs and thought leaders in both business and government. Under his leadership, the council has been recognized as one of the top private sector think tanks in the world. He also serves as senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in DC. And most importantly, we like to say, he's also a member of the board at the Center for Global Business. Tonight, Eric will be joined by the academic director of the Center for Global Business and research professor of DOIT here at Maryland Smith. Please join me in welcoming Eric Peterson and Kisleya Prasad.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. My job here is going to be mainly as an interviewer. So you've probably, several of you might have seen the report. So we'll try and go through all of them one by one, and then I'll open it up for questions. But before we get started, I thought I would mention Marina's given a wonderful introduction to Eric, but I want to thank him for coming here for this annual event, which I've gotten to enjoy a lot. There's no one better to break down what is happening around the world than Eric. He's a much sought-after thinker who's spoken in maybe 50 countries, before the World Economic Forum, TED Talks. So really, we're grateful to him for taking the time out to come to the Smith School and talk to all of us. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And these are complex, volatile, difficult times, and globally, and the speed with which this coronavirus has now spread around the world also reminds us that globalization has had unintended consequences. And it'll tie in with some of the themes. But before we start talking about this report, I want to know how you did last year with last year's predictions. And so if you'll remind us very quickly what those predictions were and how you fared with that.
Last year we had 10 predictions. I won't run through them all. But we did reasonably well. In fact, we were only off, I think, somewhat on 3 of the 10. And we gave ourselves a C grade on those 3. But we had a number of the others right. This is a copy of the year ahead predictions that we will be talking about tonight. And in the back, here is the report card that we give ourselves in terms of how well we did last year. And Kisleya has kindly allowed me to tee this up so it doesn't sound quite as bad as our own projections would suggest. We did a couple very easy ones. For example, we did anticipate that the then taking off trade conflict between Washington and Beijing would intensify over the course of the year. That is absolutely right.
Absolutely,
I think
exactly,
that was a big one. We talked about the global trash crisis and how it would spur innovation in a number of areas, and it did. We called that one. Shipping industry will crash into new sulfur regulations. For those of you who track that, it's absolutely true. The one at a geopolitical, we were just talking about this in class here, in geopolitics, that we would see a closer relationship between Russia and China certainly came to pass. This is what we call the Xi-Putin bromance, but that we managed to call, and a number of others. But let me, in a spirit of modesty here, tell you about the ones that we didn't call very well. The first was we thought that a sand shortage would create some more profound dislocations on global construction than it really did. There was a fast substitution of trading elements there that we didn't project very well. And the one that we took the biggest bath on, that I'll confess here publicly, is this one. Prediction 2 from last year. Bitcoin will lead the consolidation and maturation of the cryptocurrency market. For those of you who are heavily invested in Bitcoin, I'm very sorry that we were wrong, but we were. We gave ourselves a 50% on that one, but I think we could have been even more difficult on ourselves. Yeah. So we did all right. But
that's fairly good. As this old saying goes, it's very hard to predict, especially the future. So I think that worked out really well. So let's get to this year's report. So when I was reading this year's report, a general sense I was getting, before we get into the individual ones, that our time of reckoning with the consequences of climate change is becoming very, very close. And I think that runs through a number of those. So maybe I'll start with the first one that, most recently Greta Thunberg has become a household name and the face of the climate change movement. And she's been passionate about raising the alarm about the fact that time is running out for people in her generation. And it's no longer the hypothetical of my childhood. And it's scary that the science was basically settled back, back in the 70s and 80s, but we still haven't done much about it. But your report speaks in fairly dire terms about a generational war that is heating up. And can you talk to that?
Sure. This is a tough one to begin with. But the way we see it, some of the generational divides now are getting wider and wider. And Thunberg is emblematic of that widening divide right now. Quite extraordinary when you think about lack of action on climate change. We were talking about this in the class immediately prior here, accumulation of debt that will be passed to the younger people in this room and their cohorts in the future. There are significant divergences in terms of interests, capabilities, attitudes that seem now to be getting all the more profound. Now, why we called that this year in 2019 for 2020 is that we're reaching a number of critical inflection points, demographic inflection points. Fact of the matter is that Zs are now outnumbering millennials across the world. And we're also beginning to see, and this was another one of the symptoms that we thought was really quite significant, we're beginning to see a number of young people in the streets in various capitals across the world. Think Chile, think Lebanon, think a number of other countries where we can show that there seems to be a significant divide. Add to that, differences that we can document empirically that are beginning to show up in the major indices that exist with respect to trust in institutions, in governments, in private sector, civil society, and a range of other organizations that are critical to all of our lives in one way or another. Well, what the data are showing now is that there has been a sudden decompression of trust, that people are saying, wait a minute, we're not going to buy on. And on top of that, they're looking for alternative venues for going forward. And the attitudinal differences between generational cohorts seems to be getting quite profound.
I'll speak to India, where recently the government there came up with sort of populist proposals, which would have treated people who sought to migrate to India on the basis of persecution, made a distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims, and they made the argument that these are people, the countries that they're including are Muslim countries, and that led to sort of students mobilizing on the streets. And there what you're seeing is, for the first time, they're there for defending the Constitution and the secular nature of the state. But it's mostly been college kids who are out on the streets. So again, when you speak of the generational divide, maybe there's an optimistic side to it, that values are being defended in a way by this generation.
That's right.
That we're at risk right now.
Yeah. I have a dear friend, a former colleague who's no longer with my firm, who's in Iowa right now doing the caucuses. Can you imagine? And he likes Biden. He worked for Biden as chief of staff years and years ago, and he's representing Joe Biden. And he says it's I talked to him today. He says it's how the older cohorts are kind of going with the more conservative option, at least in the Iowa context. Of course, that is not representative of the overall party in the U.S. or anything else, but still in the Iowa context, and how this age is a Bernie nation, Bernie brothers and sisters, that are working. And he's saying that many of the younger people are in fact disruptive in the context of this caucus. So I think we're beginning to see this collision of attitudes, but I think you're right. I think it's something to be very positive about, and that especially younger people now seem perhaps to be more values-driven than their parents and grandparents. Yeah.
So we'll move on. Carrying on with the climate theme, you say that cities will accelerate attempts to meet the climate challenge. And again, I'll ask you to elaborate on that. So.
With pleasure. In the face of this polarization that we're seeing, not only in the U.S. but elsewhere, it's getting more and more difficult at the national level, let alone the provincial or state level or whatever kind of intermediate level, to make things happen. And what we're finding, looking at countries across the world, India is a great example of this with the great cities that it has. But the upshot is that a lot of the action now is happening at city level. That's where the rubber hits the road. And what we're also seeing is that cities are responsible for dealing with a number of significant opportunities and challenges to go with climate change. They're big emitters, and they know it. So the challenge exists that what can they do to create higher efficiencies and less by way, how do they begin to think about negative emission technologies or practices that might be helpful in that regard. And then on the other hand, there are a number of very innovative programs that have come to be, a lot of examples that we endeavor to highlight in our report, which suggests that really we're seeing a grassroots revolution in effect on broader environmental issues happening at not the national level, but at the city level.
And that's because, well, if you're living in Miami, you're at risk from climate change in a way that you're not if you're living in the heartland. Though even there, I mean, all the floods, which is going to lead to the next question, floods and other things that are direct consequences. So much of what cities have to do is to plan for, now not in the very distant future, what are they going to do about flooding? Because so much of the human population around the world lives in coastal regions for sensible traditional reasons, access to water and transportation. But that's something we need to do something about. But moving on, in part because of the climate crisis, but also for other reasons, disasters have become more frequent. And human populations are also often in more vulnerable situations, and you speak of a disaster economy emerging. And I think we tell our students nowadays that the artificial intelligence is in the future and you need to prepare for that. But unfortunately, a promising industry of the future is abatement and management of disasters. And how does your report see the disaster economy and what industries are going to be hot in the context of the disaster economy?
2019 was a disastrous year. And by that I mean that there were a number of significant and costly disasters in various countries and regions that really set back the broader social and political agenda in significant ways. And that's tragic. We can all stipulate to that. But what we're beginning to see now is a more refined and harmonized attempt by a whole range, a coalition of actors to address the consequences of these disasters. For example, there are a number of companies and skills and capabilities that are now being developed to take on some of the hurricanes and the flooding and the other consequences that come with this. And we're seeing it is fortunately, because it's a growth industry.
Growth industry, yeah.
And that's why but we're feeling pretty sure that we'll see significant growth in this area over the year ahead. I remember years ago I was called to the White House, and there were a number of corporate representatives there, and they wanted to talk about the National Security Council, how these large corporations could work to address some of these disasters. And we talked about everything. How does Walmart use its vast parking lots, the aggregate size of which is, very, very big, and could be very helpful in the case of, these kinds of, whole range of communication issues involving telecommunications companies. But what was clear to me then was that there wasn't a lot of pre-positioned communication, thinking, authentically strategic thought about what could be done. And now we're seeing a difference in that. The circumstances are tragic, to be sure, but at least we seem to be doing a little more than we had before.
Yeah. And in many parts of the developing world, kinds of cyclones that would have caused death toll in the thousands, now barely a handful of people. So early warning systems have become good, and then just the logistics and pre-preparation, getting food and other things to people very, very quickly, medical help. So that's all become good. But that's again part of this industry that's arisen on dealing with disasters.
But even in this country, the case of Puerto Rico, I don't know if we have anybody from Puerto Rico here, but what a tragic set of circumstances that was, and we see evidence of misallocation of resources there in the U.S., which is just tragic. And to be sure, we need to be thinking about a number of developing world countries as well.
Yeah. So again, this one question, another issue that hit home for me, again, from being originally from India. So one of your predictions was on the water crisis. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that. So I think in Tamil Nadu, there was a very bad water crisis last summer, people having to queue up in long lines to take away small amounts of water for cleaning and cooking. And that's, to me, always a dangerous situation because you run out of water, you have very angry people, you could have riots. And you find many countries have these disputes about water sharing rights from rivers. And again, climate change has a role to play here as well. So a lot of the glaciers that provide water to much of the developing world, many of those are receding in Bolivia, China, everywhere. So the prospect of the world running out of water or water scarcity scares me. So how do you predict that's going to play out?
Yeah. Imagine. Here we are on a planet with water everywhere. The problem is that most of it is salt water. And what we are seeing now are rivers drying up. We're seeing serious erosion problems as a result of water dislocations. We are seeing depletion of aquifers across the board, a range of water dislocations. Imagine for a minute if you could erase the water chalkboard right now by industry, by private use, and say, wait a minute, we need to reallocate this based on market prices. How do you think our practices would change with respect to water? And the answer is nobody knows. But the answer is also it would change a whole lot. From agricultural practices where we're trying to address things, efficiency issues with drip irrigation and GPS and satellite irrigation, a range of other factors, to the use of nanotechnologies in desal facilities across the world. There are a number of kind of core issues that seem to be coming together right now. But have no doubts, we're on countdown right now because the water dislocations are going to be coming fast and furious. And we think that this year we'll be seeing, in particular, a lot of them because of the rapid shift in weather patterns that is creating drought conditions from Latin America, creating difficulties in Africa, certainly in South Asia and elsewhere. And so our view is that in the end, we're going to be seeing these serious water issues on the one hand, but on the other hand, on the more positive side, that companies, NGOs, and scientists and others are coming up with much smarter, much more efficient ways to make things happen. So we can be hopeful, but I think we have our hands full. And if there's anyone here who can walk away from this event tonight saying, look, I'd like to focus on water, because think about it, human health, the cohesion of societies, broader economics. If you look at governance issues, when you have several countries on a river, whether it's Ethiopia, Egypt, or whether it's the Tigris Euphrates, or whether it's the Colorado River here closer to home, these kinds of competing interests on limited water resources are going to get all the more difficult for us to sustain.
Exactly. Again, to elaborate on the point that there's always a positive side to the story, you think of a country that took a disadvantage and turned it into an advantage. Israel is a great example. So the country has a lot of water shortage, but they've become the leaders in the technology to optimally use small amounts of water, desalination, drip irrigation, for things like that. And that technology has become an important export industry for them. So often these things, when you have difficulties and problems, you can creatively turn them around into advantages. We'll turn on to a topic that's less grim, and it reminds me of some of my favorite restaurants in the DC area. This is the halal market.
Halal.
And so first, if you could tell for everybody what is halal, and then why you predict that the halal market is poised to take off right now.
The halal market is, as we define it, are a range of products and services that satisfy the Muslim community. And in our view, it is on absolute takeoff right now. And at the core of it is the broader food, set of food products. And I'm no surprise to you, I'm with you on that. There's some wonderful examples here in the Washington area. But it runs the gamut in terms of services that are geared to observance of Muslim practices. And we think that this economy is going to go big places in the next couple of years, but in particular, we're expecting a spike this year.
So is the reason for it the state of the economies?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So we've looked at correlations in terms of Muslim communities in various economies, and what we're seeing is a strong correlation between positive growth prospects and what we think will be higher per capita consumption.
So we'll move on from halal to the tech sector, and we'll talk first about the race for race for 5G, which is maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it later. What Boris Johnson's done there has been quite fascinating with 5G. But I noticed that you make the prediction that the US will encounter challenges. So I was hoping you'd first again tell everybody briefly what 5G is. They might already know, but just as a reminder. And then why does it take off now, and where is the US placed in this?
5G's latest generation in communication, which will create new capabilities far beyond the already remarkable iPhones that you have in your pockets. It will, in fact, empower the Internet of Things and the remarkable convergence of all kinds of devices and sensors and other elements that will make up our society in the next few years. 5G is a very, very big deal. And there are a number of national and also corporate players now that are trying to take a commanding heights position. How many of you watched the Super Bowl last night? Quite a few of you, right? You saw a few 5G commercials last night, and it was absolutely no surprise. Those are the private companies, but if you look behind the scenes right now in terms of the component parts of technology stacks between the US and China, for example, 5G is one of two areas, that and artificial intelligence, that are the big proxies now for national competition in the technology space. So whoever can get to 5G first will have considerable advantages. Artificial intelligence, same thing. AI, same thing. But we all need to be watching the 5G race. Now, we have our doubts, though, about the US because there's pushback. The not in my backyard syndrome of towers, local pushback in terms of localization of elements, we're beginning to see the signs of a kind of techlash here. Again, at the city and state and provincial levels in the community. And the upshot here is that we think that we may see some slower than expected progress on people who don't want towers in their backyard and a number of other factors.
Yeah, could you also speak about Huawei? Because I thought it was fascinating. Boris Johnson, more than anything else right now, he needs a free trade agreement or something, some kind of a trade deal with the United States. And he took the risk of making President Trump very unhappy by saying that they won't shut Huawei out of the network that's being built in the United Kingdom. So tell us a bit about Huawei, its leadership in this field, and how our policies towards Huawei affect the state of the U.S. in this race?
Your question is structured very well because it is leadership in the field. Huawei has a very significant position in the movement to 5G right now. And we have seen in this country the development of concerns that Huawei hardware may allow for backdoor or some other kind of intervention, and that there are non-commercial links, non-commercial factors linked to national security that should be considered. So on national security grounds, among others, this country has tried to, in policy and practice, has tried to limit Huawei. There have been some legal battles and some other issues that I won't touch on here, but suffice it to say that I mentioned the connection between competition on key technologies, exponential technology issues between Washington and Beijing. And 5G is a very, very significant part of that competition. So where will it all go? What we're seeing is a clash of systems here. And my guess is that we're likely to see a number of countries that don't have the capacity to come up with the vast technology capabilities that the U.S. and China, as part of the Make in China 2025 and some of the other broader national efforts, are coming up with. And what that means is they're going to be caught in the middle in one way or another. I had the opportunity to meet with a business figure from Australia recently who said, you know, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we have the very strong economic links to China in our own neighborhood, but you know, we've had a kinship and a political and security connection with the West for a long time too. How will we balance that, he asked. And I think that that's probably a mere down payment on what a number of countries are going to be doing. Are we on the verge of a technology Cold War? You know, it's a good question. I hope not. But in the end, we need to be thinking in ways where we can, I hope, more constructively avoid these kind of confrontations and also the negative effects that it creates.
Thank you. So from the 5G race to the space race, so it's getting awfully crowded out in space right now. If you, so what do you think of the space race? And then after that, I'll ask you about the President's Space Forces as well. So.
Well, I have to do the Star Trek on that, right?
Yeah.
But look, this space race. 1967 was the year when the UN decided to put an agreement together on the demilitarization of space. And that was after the early phases of the space race. We all remember Sputnik in, what was 57, I believe. And then the very intense US program after that. And there was concern that there would be huge militarization of space after that. And then we took a pause. We flew to the moon and spent some time there. Yeah. And now the number of players has multiplied quite considerably, the number of space powers on the one hand. And on the other hand, we now have a number of companies in the mix as well. Yeah. SpaceX is the one that we're all watching. I mean, I don't know about you, but it took my breath away when I saw the booster come down and stick it on a raft in the middle of the ocean. I mean, it's just unbelievable. In the old days, we'd be waiting for the parachutes to deploy on the capsules, and just a whole different world. Well, now, as a practical consequence of this orchestra of space players, now we're seeing the introduction of massive numbers of elements in low Earth orbit and higher. And there was a lot of stuff up there already. So now we have to be tracking things very carefully. You probably saw in the news a few days ago that we had a near miss over Pittsburgh, I believe it was. But the bottom line here is we have a lot of active and inactive objects encircling the planet in ways that are devastatingly difficult to control.
Right. Yes, it's like really the trash problem that
That's
you were
right.
talking about last year.
Exactly.
Now that's extended out into space.
Let me tell you a story.
Yeah. Okay.
This is long before SpaceX ever came to be, but the Soviet Union used to have a series of satellites called the Cosmos satellites, a few of which are still kind of going around so far as I know. And they had degraded coverage in 1992 when a scientific rocket launched from the Andøya test range in Norway set off an alert that took the nuclear football to the then Russian president. And they lit it up with launch codes and everything else because they were afraid that a mere scientific rocket, which was designed, by the way, to study the northern lights of all things, was an attack on the Soviet Union. And now that degraded capability is still kind of going around us, and it kind of represents the generations of use of space over the years. And now, of course, all of the new SpaceX mini satellites that are going up make things all the more complicated in the future.
Exactly. And then I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, which is on data privacy. So data privacy is something which we all claim to value a lot, but then we trade it away for the most minor conveniences. And I want to ask you how you see the evolution of the global data privacy rules. Where are we headed with respect to that in the coming year and beyond?
Well, the front runner in terms of establishing a regulatory and legal framework for this is Europe, of course, the EU. And the EU is now moving toward a more aggressive position with respect to use of cloud and reliance on some of the FANGs on this side and some of the BATs on the other, and, you know, except for the UK and Huawei, and the exception that you raised. But in the end, as we look now at data privacy, we believe that there'll be a takeoff in terms of, in a number of countries, that enact legislation or adopt policies that mimic what we've seen in Europe. And, you know, I think we all realize that as more and more companies mine our lives in one way or another for details, and I don't know if any of you have kind of looked at your profiles on the internet. It's pretty frightening to know what they know or the beginning of what they know. I think there's likely to be a push in this direction, and that's why it made our list this year.
So you mean outside of the EU, and I don't know where the United States will go on this, but in other countries,
yes,
definitely.
We're behind in the US. We're behind. Yeah.
Okay, there were a couple of other things, but I think at this point, just looking at the clock, I'll turn it over to you for questions, and then we'll take it from there. Yeah. So just remember the rules Marina mentioned. There are 2 microphones. Go there, identify yourselves, and pose a question to Eric.
I'm going to drive home thinking they agreed with every word I said, you know.
Well, while you're coming up with... Oh, please, go ahead. Yes, either one of the mics, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, a lot of the predictions for 2020 kind of centered around climate change and global warming. What would you advise to businesses to do to be more sustainable and eco-friendly? And what do you do in your everyday life to be more eco-friendly and sustainable?
Good, thank you. 2, possibly 3 questions there. Let me unpack them in the order they were raised.
Yes, yeah.
First is, yes, we're focused on climate change. And as I said in a class prior to our meeting here tonight, we're in good company in thinking about this. There are a number of groups now that are thinking long and hard about what role private sector in particular can and should be playing in the face of some of the frustrations that we see expressed by Thunberg and others. And if you look at, for example, the global risk index that comes out of the World Economic Forum, you'll see that across the major priorities there, that climate change is written into virtually every one of them. And that's as it should be, in our view. So at least we're beginning to identify it. Now, second point is, are corporations doing enough to address it? Answer, emphatic no, they are not. Many of them are wishing it away. Many of them are concerned about wringing out costs on bottom line and not thinking about top line growth. Others have skewed incentive frameworks and that are not in a mode to be thinking authentically and strategically about how big ticket a problem this really is. So I hope we can do a whole lot more. And now we're beginning to hear more from a few companies. But the upshot is that it's too little, I hope not too late. But specific things that we can be doing and what I can be doing in my personal life. First of all, what companies can be doing. They can be investing in cutting edge technology now. I'm part of a group called the Energy Transition Institute at Kearney. I'm on the board. And we just put out, I'd invite you to visit the website, very proud of it, looking at decarbonization strategies and a range of other factors. We just put out a report on hydrogen that is fantastic, but the one before that might be even more interesting for this audience. It looks at negative emission technologies and what the very significant complexities at work in that issue. So we need to do a whole lot more to think through options and then try to bring them into effect. What do? I personally try to do what I can for climate change, but I have to admit to you, I travel all the time and my carbon footprint is awful and I feel bad about it. I'm not in Thunberg's position of taking a sailboat every time I have a client meeting in Asia. But the bottom line is that we're trying to do a lot more in terms of video conferencing now, practices at work and not involving travel. I think we've done quite a bit to wring out strategies that are emitting, but you can never do enough. And I also try to do this personally in my home.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and to just add a thought to that, to the question of what do you do, I think gets also to a question of how much we can accomplish by individual action versus regulation. And I think this is a field where we need regulation. So what do? I do support groups that push for more stringent regulation because I have some sense that that's where the big difference, the big delta is going to come from. Other questions?
Hi.
Yes, yeah, please.
I guess similar question. So a lot of my family lives in China, and they tell me about how like in the last few years, like people have been so like they give off the impression that like they're doing a lot more for climate these few years, and like sometimes we can't really tell if it's true or not. Like before, like it would just be like a trash bin in every person's house. Sorry, but now they like in their like community there'll be like 9 different bins for like different things, and it's really strange because then once the trash people come to pick it up, it all goes to the same truck, and so I guess on one aspect, like, do you think people are using climate change like in a deceptive way in business practices? And in another question, I guess not exactly related, how do we incentivize businesses to be more environmentally friendly? Because another worry or like thought that's been going through my mind is that like, do companies like refuse to do it because it would lose competitive edge, right? Especially US versus China, where like in China, a lot of people don't care. They just kind of do whatever. And so things end up being cheaper. How would we like maintain competitiveness while also being environmentally friendly here in the US?
Yep. Or perhaps you ought to reframe that question and say, can you do it? Is it possible? Because when you have very significant asymmetries between practices across countries, on environment, on labor, on a range of other factors that are instrumental to business, it's pretty clear that you can get a big advantage if your economics are going in the right direction. So how do you correct for that? Well, you do it like we've tried in successive agreements in North America with NAFTA and USMAC, USCMA. And you try to get adjustments. I have to tell this audience that I'm glad that we didn't make a prediction about USCMA in our forecast, our year-ahead prediction last year, because I would have thought it impossible, especially on the far right, the tariff group on the one hand, and the environment and labor group on the left on the other. I thought it was politics by ever wider standard deviation, and the capacity for movement in the trade realm was difficult. And I have to tell you that I was very, very pleasantly surprised by the cohesion that we saw in that, despite all the other polarization that exists. But you highlight a big problem. There are very different practices with respect to a whole range of environment and human health and other issues across societies, and we need to find ways as best we can to correct for them. The first question that you asked, are companies the real deal, or are they looking to manipulate? And the answer is probably yes and yes. There are a number of companies that I've come to know pretty well and admire. For example, there's a speaker who was at a meeting of ours last year. I can say this because it's a matter of public record, from Ørsted. Have any of you heard of Ørsted? Ørsted is a Danish company that used to be gas and oil and has converted now to wind power altogether, and is now as I understand it, the largest non-sea wind power firm on the planet right now. And it took remarkable leadership for them to say, look, we're going to move away from oil and gas and into wind, and then to develop, then to make it happen, then to develop a commanding position. And then, unfortunately, there are a number of other examples of companies that haven't shown nearly that kind of courage and determination.
Thank you.
To add on the positive side, again, the governments of countries like India and China are under pressure from local populations in a way that they were not in the past. So our old thinking was that worrying about the environment is a rich country's problem, and we have this bigger problem of global poverty that we're dealing with. But when you go breathe the air in New Delhi or Beijing at the wrong times of the year, you realize that the incidence of respiratory diseases in children's been going up, and that gets parents worried, and then they're very actively trying to control pollution. So I think there is pressure from on governments now to take care of this problem.
Mounting pressure.
Mounting pressure,
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah.
Please.
Hi, my name is Lily Harrington, and I'm a marketing and management double major. I'm a sophomore, just to introduce myself. I wanted to ask about AI, and in the sense that AI is coming. There's no way to prevent it at this point. Like, that has passed, but getting prepared for it hasn't passed. And you spoke on the issue of the U.S. struggling to accept it. Could you speak more to that, and what could we do as the Generation Z or whatever? What could we do to better prepare ourselves, especially as students?
AI is a remarkably challenging public policy phenomenon, and also social and economic issue. And I think by AI, many people understand very different things. But this journey began sometime back with narrow AI, where you could teach a computer to beat you at chess or something like that. We're moving into general AI now, where a computer can begin to replicate what you do every day when you cross the street by looking in different directions and thinking about the depth of the curb and a number of other issues all at the same time. Now we're beginning to see it with autonomous vehicles and that kind of thing. And then soon, we're going to move into this brave new world of supercomputing and generalized or machine learning based AI. I don't know if you've all seen the reports, those of you tracking AI, but they're quite frightening when you see how AI is able to teach itself in a relatively short period of time. What we've amassed hundreds, even perhaps thousands of years trying to develop on our side. For example, those of you who are know the game Go, that would be normally defined as a narrow AI phenomenon. But there was a London-based group that taught itself how to play Go and defeated the best human Go player in the world within a week or so, I think. I don't remember the exact amount, but a few days, the space of a few days. So now the question is, where does it all go? Well, AI still works with parameters and algorithms that we ourselves write. We need to worry whether there are biases or other issues in those algorithms that may surface themselves with these incredible capabilities that we have. But you know, to build on the positive outlook here, I'm very excited about AI. I do not subscribe to the notion that we're all going to become gray goo at some point as a result of artificial intelligence. But what we need to do is be thinking very, very systematically about how AI is controlled, to get back to the point that Kislaya raised about regulation and the role of government and legislation and regulation.
And I think we, as a country, will be all right if the entrepreneurial spirit stays alive. Because whenever technology has come in and disrupted some occupations or professions or industries, there are many more that have come up. So yes, I missed the corner bookstore and Amazon killed it, but the internet created so many different businesses and business models that was very hard to foresee back in the early 90s when the internet was coming around. And I think the same thing will be true here. There'll be new industries and new occupations that will come up, and if you just have to be agile and flexible and to find the opportunities and to build on them. And I think entrepreneurially, and you'll be fine as a generation.
Hear, hear.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Lily.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Cody Millen. I'm actually a linguistics major and just taking a business course as one of my electives. One of the things that you mentioned in your report was that you forecast a possible degradation in the relations between Japan and South Korea, and that could have an effect on the technology market. So could you go into a little bit more detail on what would be both the global ramifications of that, and then also what would be the impact to us as American consumers?
Yep. Thank you for that, Cody. Bottom line is it's already happening. We've already seen significant tensions rise between Tokyo and Seoul. And the reason for this are a number of historical and territorial and other policy issues that are now sharply focused. We talk in our report about the Korean Peninsula more generally. And we're quite worried about a revival of the kinds of serious tensions, not from either Japan or South Korea, but rather from North Korea and Pyongyang over the course of the next 11 and a half months. Here, we're most concerned about the possibility of a revival of long-range rocket tests and then nuclear. So the Christmas surprise that Kim Jong-un promised us all was declaratory in its nature. But I'm worried that we may see something in practice very soon on that. How will it affect the U.S.? It's amazing now how we're watching a number of technology companies dealing with successive waves across countries. We've seen Samsung, we've seen a number of powerhouse technology companies in Japan. We've seen it elsewhere. There's kind of a number of waves, and part of the wave has also shifted now to China, which, as I suspect you know, is investing very significantly in its technology capabilities. And my sense is that there will be competition on a bilateral basis between Japan and South Korea. It's already manifested in some buying patterns and trade issues. But it will go beyond that. The question is, how do you build an innovation strategy as part of your broader national strategy, especially with these behemoths like the U.S. and China in the neighborhood and vying for influence?
Thank you.
Turn to the next question on this side.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm actually a mechanical engineering major. I'm also here for an elective. But the one thing you brought up that I keep coming back to is most of the topics that you talk about are like we see in the news very frequently, and you can tell that they're coming on the rise. But one that's interesting is you said the rise of the halal market. And I was just more curious if you could go a little bit more into why this year in particular you see like a rise in that industry, because I feel like I haven't heard of a huge increase in the Muslim population. Or
No, not a
at least
question
ever.
of rise in population, no.
Right, but, so I was just wondering, yeah.
It's the per capita economics. And we're not predicting that. So in fact, my unit right now is finalizing a 3-year global economic outlook as we speak. They're working on it right now. And we've run four scenarios on this to think about this. And then we've attached to those scenarios econometric forecasting to ask where we'll be. And the span of outcomes is quite wide in 4 scenarios. 0.2% average growth, global growth over the next 3 years to 3.7%. But I think that it's likely whatever does happen, and scenarios should be viable, plausible options, all of which we plan for. But I would put my money on a little higher. The IMF is projecting 3.2% for this year, 3.3% for next year, and it's not as healthy. It's not the great boom that we had hoped to see for a number of developing countries, some of which have significant Muslim populations. But it's enough to kind of show huge momentum, in particular in Indonesia and Malaysia, in part of the ASEAN countries, where we expect per capita consumption to rise markedly. So the Big Bang is more or less there, but then across this suite of services that's in the halal economy, the halal community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we've come to the end of our time. So thank you, everybody, for your kind attention. And please join me in thanking Eric. Warm round of applause, please.
Thank you. Please come back next year. You can tell me what we got right and what we got wrong.
If you're at 289, we're going to stay in here.
You all can fill out your evaluations and hand them when you're open.
And I believe